Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lemper, your regular host. On today's episode, we've been setting this episode up for a while. I'll do the intro in 2 seconds, but we're going to talk about field hygiene. We've got some issues with the field component, and we'll talk about that as we go through the episode. But the basis is how to look after yourself and the soldiers that you're responsible for. My guest today is Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Wing. He was an infantry officer at the 2nd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment and the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. He deployed to East Timor as a Company 2IC, as an adjutant to the Solomons, and a combat team commander in Afghanistan before he switched targets. And we talked about this in his last episode with the military classification system, but switched roles, conducting 12 years of medical training to become a doctor. His last posting was the Senior Medical Officer at Joint Health Unit Southern New South Wales and ACT, and he's now the Senior Medical Officer for Director of Army Health. Welcome again to the podcast, sir.
Hey, it's great to be here, Todd. Thanks for having me back on after the last one. I hope that people got what they needed out of that one.
Yeah, awesome. And if you haven't listened, go back, because it is centred on how to sort of understand and negotiate the military classification system. And we made a few things I think that were not common knowledge. I think there's a few awesome tidbits in there that we really fleshed out.
Yeah, no. And just if I can, a quick advertisement is the first thing is, I guess because I go around, I've been around to Darwin and Townsville recently, and as commanders, it's really important. The language we use is how we give verbal orders, and it's how we verbalise our intent. And I think it's really important that when we're talking around the military employment classification system, that we look at using words that aren't positive or negative in their inference. So rather than use what is part of the culture within wider defence is the downgrade, upgrade, we use reclassify. Because as Dougie Pashley, or I should say Brigadier Doug Pashley, up in 1 Brigade used to say when he was CO2RAR, is that rehab is just a stop on a journey. It's not the end game. And so people will reclassify to J31 and they'll reclassify back to deployable mechs at J1, 2 or L or M or J29. And so it's really important, I think, that we use language appropriately, not to imply any disadvantage to the people we're looking after. But I'll leave that one for everyone else to ponder for a second. And the other thing I'd like to do, quick advertisement, along the lines of if you're not shopping army, you're paying way too much, is if you have a registered dependent, don't run to your nearest orderly room or clerk who can someone who help you. Register them for the ADF Dependent Health Program. It's a wonderful scheme. You've got to opt in to do it. But that will mean that all of the gaps between Medicare and what you're paying or what your dependent is paying at the GP, and if you've got a lot of kids like I do in the middle of flu season in Canberra where you might be in and out of the GP probably more than you're going to work at the moment, savings do add up. So remember that. You're not shopping army, paying way too much. Go and register your dependent for the ADF Dependent Family Health Program. Sorry, Todd, to steal your limelight.
That's the advertisements. I like that, sir. That's awesome. Hey, so if we come back onto Line OT with the current episode, the field hygiene, we're going to talk about that. So we did an episode on Milne Bay with Colonel Young, and he talked about, we talked about 75 and 76 Squadron flying with significant dysentery. You made the argument, MacArthur's quote, and it's going to come out in the episode, I think, which is that I think, what was it? So 1/3 of his force had...
Yeah, he said, I only need 1 division to rout the Pacific of Japanese, but I need 3 divisions because at any one time I have 1 with the disease, 1 recovering from the dreaded disease, and 1 that is able to fight. So, yeah, it's really important when we think about going forth, and particularly for our immediate area of interest surrounding in the moat that goes around Australia, that we actually think about what are the environmental threats. Because I think we're pretty good at acknowledging, and all our equipment and training is geared towards recognising what the combat threats are and our equipment on how to deal with that. But what are the environmental threats that we're going to be dealing with?
Yeah. And then we had Dr. Tommy Richardson on. He's just, his episode's just dropped, but it was on the Huon Peninsula, and Finchhafen did a bit of research talking about the Huon Peninsula during the Pacific Campaign and then our experience when we first deployed to East Timor, preventative med, but also field hygiene, we start to lose and they wane those skills, and we have to pick them back up straight away when we get into a training area. Into conflict or combat.
So let's not forget is that the current Chief of Armies, a platoon from what he later commanded in East Timor, Bravo Company 2RAR, was rendered combat ineffective with malaria during INTEFET. So that wasn't on the Chief's watch. That was before the Chief deployed with INTEFET. However, that's the kind of thing we had, and it was very much, if you talk to people who deployed at that time, it was very much a tale of two battalions between the experiences with vector-borne diseases that 3RAR had and that which 2RAR had. And again, I'll just reiterate, the Chief didn't deploy with 2RAR during that period, but there was very different experiences based on how the commanders responded to force protection for environmental hazards.
Yeah, we'll get to commanders in a second being ultimately responsible. But before we do, I think it's important to talk about what health system would deploy to support us. How does it sort of work in terms of both here and overseas?
So I guess it's really important to think about a number of things. So right now, if we look at historically, at the end of World War II, health comprised about 8% of the total force that was mobilised. We're sitting well below that at the moment in terms of the ratio of clinical groupings to forces that are able to be deployed. There hasn't really been any commensurate growth in the health workforce across the three services, despite the commensurate increase in both force numbers to service all of the new platforms that are coming online. So what does that tell us? It tells us that a health system deployed is relying on four components, Todd. So the first one is prevention. The second one is treatment, evac, and sustainment. And that's where the clinical workforce comes into it, more in that space, the treatment, the evacuation, and the sustainment. So I guess what that tells us is we're not going to have commensurate with what we had at World War II at this point in time. So prevention is probably more important than ever right now, particularly when we're talking about the littoral environment and what the environmental hazards that are contained therein.
Yeah, so that prevention component is really important because we're going to talk about the skills to be able to do that. Before we get to the skills and how to sort of sustain yourself personally, but also as a commander, your section, can we talk about the threat, right? Why is field hygiene so important when we infill into these potential operating environments, and what's the threats?
So the big one is when we talk about field hygiene, it's implying more than the field, i.e. when we go to TFTA or Mount Bundy or that place down in South Australia, the Woomera Rocket Range and Kaltana. Now, what it is, it's when we actually deploy with our platforms and what our platforms are carrying and what we're carrying personally. And if there's move towards light just means heavy for the people who actually do it because they have to carry everything, is that it's when you are living away from fixed infrastructure, things like showers, toilets, running water, things that go over your head, you're sleeping on the ground, and you are mixing with all of the threats that are present in the environment. And if we look, once you start getting into the tropics, the threats are never ending. You've only got to see the jokes that are on Facebook, for example, about how everything in Australia wants to kill you. And when you're talking about the tropical environment, really everything from the surface and subsurface fauna, the tiniest mosquito carrying a parasite or a single strand of RNA virus to the actual climate is actively trying to kill humans. It works against our homeostasis of how we regulate everything in our body, whether that's disease, whether that's through envenomation, whether that is through the climate resulting in heat injury or illness. Now, medical's got a role to play in this too. I'd like to add is that we know, for example, that people with chronic disease, including obesity or poor physical conditioning or people who aren't vaccinated, in environments like tropical environments or in severe trauma or in infectious disease or in CBRN environments, those people will have higher rates of complications and mortality. We also know that for many of those things as well, those predisposing factors we like to call them, it also leads to worse mental health outcomes. So we're also involved in the prevention. We're partners with Command in the prevention space as well.
And I suppose the idea of this episode is the education component as well, getting out what is most common and what we're sort of fighting against, basically. That's the field itself and how harsh it is in the environment. You made the argument everything is trying to kill you.
Well, sorry to interrupt, Todd, but if you look at the recent flooding that occurred in North Queensland, for example, is that there's something that people may have heard about, like in North Queensland, called melioidosis. So that's just a small bacteria that lives in the soil. It's intracellular, so when it infects you, it gets deep inside your cells and it causes complete mayhem. Like it resulted in, I think there was, 300 or 400 infections, and we're talking about people who are living in places where they have that fixed infrastructure. They have running water every day. They have a roof over their heads. But in environments where there's extreme amount of moisture and flooding, and the soil mixes with water and people just walk through it, wait on it, get it on their shoes, tread it into their house, they become infected. And there's been a number of deaths associated with that. So when we look at potentially all of the Army moving to an environment like that, they're the types of things that will happen en masse and strip away combat power very quickly unless we're able to safeguard. So we're good at doing the PPE for example, combat threats, wear your plates, wear your Kevlar helmet, an example, and make sure you're carrying your weapon. But we also need to think about the environmental threats as well, because that can strip combat power. And as I've alluded to earlier, there's not a great deal in the treatment, evac and sustainment space if that becomes overwhelmed rapidly.
Yeah, there's no fat. If the so that was one of the illnesses using a contemporary or infections using a contemporary example. If we talk more broadly, what are the largest? So we talked about the threat. Now let's talk about infection or illness. What are the largest sort of what illnesses or infections are we likely to go down with?
Well, so there's a lot of there's things that are caused by parasites, for example, and there's things that are caused by without getting into the boring people with the nitty-gritty, you've got viruses, you've got parasites, and you've got bacteria. And within the tropical environment, there is a host of various different. The biggest one, for example, from the virus perspective, is probably dengue, and unfortunately there's no real highly effective vaccination for that currently. With Japanese encephalitis virus is another one, and people might recall after the flooding that occurred in South Australia and Victoria a couple of years ago, there was what was called Murray Valley encephalitis. Same sort of thing. These are small viral organisms. Then you've got your bacterias that live there. And the common one is the ones that we carry that, the sources of dysentery and the like are things like E. coli, which is resulting from your back passage. And then as a result, sometimes you can end up with things like urinary tract infections because your back passage is so close to where the tube comes out of your bladder, to put it eloquently, that, it's a case of incy-wincy spider climbs up the water spout, and when you're dehydrated, you're not flushing that spout out as regularly, for example. So that's some of the bacterial causes. There's also other bacterial causes as well, so things like leptospirosis, that people would have heard about, anyone who's been to the training areas of Cowley Beach or Tully. And you've also got things like scrub typhus as well, which is resulting from a bacteria that is housed in ticks. And you've also got, then moving on from that, your classic parasites that we don't have endemic in Australia, for example. And it's like dengue fever as well. That's not endemic to Australia, but we get it from time to time. When people come back from Bali, you see outbreaks. Particularly when there's people closely living together, you'll start to get clusters forming. And then you've got, the one that MacArthur spoke about during World War II that has always had and still has a great impact on mortality for humanity, and that's malaria. And you've only got to see the work of what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are trying to do to combat malaria. But the problem is, and this is one of the other problems we have when we focus too much on treatment, is when we're in World War II, we're in the early stages of things like vaccination and antibiotics is it's a bit of a double-edged sword. While we might have vaccinations now, for example, we've also, and our antibiotics, antimicrobial resistance is increasing, and that's true for malaria and other bacteria as well, so for parasites and bacteria.
I suppose that's the common illnesses or infection. If we move to how quickly do these things because you talked about a predisposition and deploying people. You didn't make this leap, but sort of deploying people with a predisposition to threat to illness and infection. How quickly can these things take a hold if we sort of infill into an environment that is sort of rife with infection?
Well, I think you're right about the predisposing thing. So they can take hold very quickly. Like I said, it was a platoon in INTEFET was rendered combat ineffective pretty quickly by malaria, and that was just they changed location and there was obviously mosquitoes around carrying the virus. And so it can take hold very quickly. We're talking relatively short incubation or infection times, depending if it's a virus, bacteria versus a parasite. And it can strip away combat power incredibly quickly. Like I understand you spoke about the 75 and 76 Squadron in Milne Bay, and they were literally flying by without the seat of their pants because of dysentery. That can rip through very, very quickly. Those, particularly anything that what they call the fecal oral route, and that's for many bacteria and many infections that, basically from your stools or your poo, you get it on your hands or something, you ingest something in your mouth, and that's how the whole thing kicks off. And it can absolutely strip combat power very, very quickly. I think it was only in 2006, for example, that the Royal Military College had to call off a number of things because of a flu outbreak that occurred there, and the infection control measures weren't that fantastic. So it can bring things to a halt very rapidly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the how quickly it is. And we talked to, I think, going back to Lieutenant Colonel Steve Young's episode on age in war, he talked about the average age of commanding officers being 38 to 42 in Europe and Africa. We infill into the Pacific, and a number of different. It's not just because the environment is so harsh, but one thing and a leading factor is that the environment is so harsh that the average age of commanding officers dropped to 26 to 28.
Yeah, and that's also too is that when you're older, you do get more predisposed with age. We recently saw that with COVID, for example, the concern, and we still do, with the concern particularly with a lot of illnesses in our community, in our civilian community that aren't exposed to any of those environmental hazards. Over 65, you want to make sure you've got influenza. You want to make sure you've had one dose of the vaccination for the bacteria most likely to cause pneumonia. And you want to be vaccinated against other things because your immune system wanes with age. Similarly, with people, there's certain conditions, medical conditions that people can have that compromise immune function, or there's treatments that they're taking that compromises immune function as well. So again, this is where I guess, command and medical hand in glove sort of have to work together to make sure that the right people are at the right place at the right time.
To not stress that medical system you talked about before.
Yeah, and make sure commanders, they can preserve combat power, through force protection measures.
So we know the threat now, what is most likely to happen if we're infected or come down with illness. Let's talk to the personal hygiene in the field, not field per se, but in an environment that is trying to sort of impact your...
Right.
Yeah. What are the sort of, how do we go about essential areas that soldiers can get after, or anyone in the army, and then subsequently what should we be taking and using in the field?
So in the civilian environment, and we've got limited data sets to back this up for the military environment as well, is that the number one reason people present to a general practitioner in Australia is skin-related conditions. Now, we've also got data that supports similar for what are the cause for DMBI in our exercise constructs that we have. And you've got to remember that maybe there's an argument there that we're not exercising for as long in the field, away from the fixed infrastructure supports of running water, roof over our heads, regular hot feeds, etc., than maybe we did 2 or 3 decades ago.
Because you can fake it for 6-8 days, right? You can fake it.
I'm gonna quote someone here. So a lot of the listeners may have read a book called In Good Company by Gary Mackay about a platoon commander's experience in Vietnam. One of his lead scouts, Jethro Hanna, used to be a senior instructor and a senior range instructor at the ROBC for Royal Australian Infantry Corps at the School of Cool at Singleton. And he used to say, I will paraphrase with some, he used to say, any F-wit can survive in the field, but to thrive and live requires rigid attention to discipline and SOPs. Otherwise, they'll be combat ineffective. That's what he used to say. And that was also echoed by a number of people that I think he might have had involvement with the DS at Tully at the time in the late 90s, early 2000s. So take that for a moment, is that you can probably cuff a 5-day activity tactical on Red Bulls, if you're that way inclined, particularly for the younger generation. Being the age I am, I'm probably not that suited to it, Todd. But you can cuff things to a degree, and it's very easy to go, oh, there's no point taping that blister on my foot because,
we'll be out of here.
We'll be out of here in no time. Like it's easy to fall into a trap of taking the easy wrong over the hard right. So what are we talking about? Going back to skin. So skin protects us. It's a big organ system and it covers around us. So that's probably what we're most focused in. Now, the Chinese call infantry soldiers, or just soldiers in general, bulbing. Bul means the foot. So probably the number one thing we need to look after is our feet. Because when we're outfield for extended periods and on our feet and we're carrying load and things like that, we tend to create an environment that's a bit different for our foot than when we're in our home environment and we are, washing every day, putting on clean socks and the like. It's important to air your feet out. Because the one thing we know about skin, it's a bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It has to be just right. So if it's too dry, you'll get cracks. You'll eventually break down that barrier of your skin. What'll happen then is you'll get infection because we're covered in bacteria anyway, and bacteria will get into that site and then create an infection. And then it's like most things, if you don't get onto it early, and when you think about it, in our culture, we have a lot of sayings like a stitch in time saves 9, that, small wound became a gaping ulcer. They're all things that actually happen when you leave things unattended. So going back to skin, not too dry. You certainly don't want it too wet. And so you've got to take active measures. Wearing socks all the time, make sure that our feet don't get too dry. However, wearing socks all the time, particularly in a tropical environment where it rains lots, means that they're going to be wet quite a lot of the time, which means you have to take active measures to dry them out. And this is where it gets into, this field hygiene is actually a combat multiplier. So you don't lose people. You don't lose people limping, because we know that, like, everyone's seen what happens if you stick your hand or, in a spa or hot water or a bath for too long. It becomes macerated and it becomes a lot easier to tear the skin. Throw that when you're carrying load, from your body armour through to your webbing, plus what you need to survive on your back, plus it might be a weapon system, is that skin's going to break down really quick. And once you can't use your feet, you start to become combat ineffective pretty quickly. But more broadly as well, we have a lot of points on our skin where rubbing occurs. Now, this is why we train. We try and train the way we're going to fight so that we can identify those points early, and you can do things like what we call, it's called prophylactic strapping, or where those rub points are, you can apply tape. You can take actions early to prevent the start of a condition occurring with your skin. So a classic example of that as well, like wounds on your hands, if you don't treat them with, scrub them out, clean them, there's an old saying, if a wound's infected, make it uninfected. If a wound's too wet, make it more dry. If a wound's too dry, make it moist. That's kind of what you've got to do and manage, and that's what people have to manage as well. There's no real art to wound management. Small wound management is make sure it doesn't get infected, keep it covered, or keep it exposed where it's not going to be exposed to grit and the like that are going to bring infection into the wound.
That's the skin component covered. Yeah. If we talk about the cleanliness component and sort of you talked about the absence of flowing water and soap, do wet wipes and then subsequently antimicrobial like solutions, do they help? Is that?
Yeah, so they do. All of this helps because what it does, like it's ideal, in the ideal world, if you've got dirt on your hands, if you can, try and clean the dirt off because the dirt is going to hold those pieces of bacteria, those single strands of virus, whatever. However, if you can get that off your hands to begin with, but in the absence of not being able to do that too, putting something on there that's going to kill them is pretty effective. The only problem is that dirt will often remain afterwards, and so bits that aren't dead, because when you go to kill something, any organism, there's always ones that are resistant. So you give them a dose, and then the only thing that's left to propagate again for the survival of the species is the ones that were resistant. That's kind of how we get into antimicrobial resistance, for example. So you want to give it a dose, but wherever you can, try and practice cleanliness. You don't want to say cleanliness is godliness. However, the cleaner you can be, the less likely and the less predisposed you will be to infection in your skin. Does that help?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. Yeah.
And there's no hard and fast rules.
Using your battle spoon for 28 days straight and being proud of it, not cleaning any of your hands and stuff, like it's got to be.
Might be a bit guilty of doing that from time to time.
Yeah.
But you clean it.
Yeah. No, fair.
Sorry, you're talking to someone who used to shave and drink out of the same cup, although it's not highly recommended.
Yeah.
Again, you can take measures to make sure these things are clean in the field, as best you can.
Yeah.
And I guess it goes back to that so far as reasonably practicable piece.
Yeah.
Like, we're not going to bring an autoclave out there to autoclave people's threads after every meal. However, it's so far as reasonably practicable. But we could probably argue at the moment from our disease and non-battle injury rates that we are maybe not as good at doing this as what we once were. And it seems to be every time we go through a period of mass mobilisation or we do something differently, we go through a harsh relearning process. And it's probably better if we can do that up front.
Yeah.
I don't think we've spoken about it yet, but the Cove Battle Lab article that was published, I think 3 weeks ago on field hygiene is an excellent reference source for any commander and any individual, because it's an individual responsibility too. And this is another thing, Todd, like we talk about, a lot of people think, all of this workplace health and safety stuff is going to disappear once we mobilise and the like. But a lot of work health safety stuff, that's why it's called work safe. It's actually a force protection measure to ensure that we don't unnecessarily lose combat power that's available to command to achieve the mission.
Yeah, that's heaps of stuff there to get into. But the cleanliness, not being proud in being filthy, we didn't talk about that. But there's an element like for the first 3 days, no one does anything because it's like, I'm in the field, I might as well be filthy. It's like
from the get-go.
That's a mindset that lasts for 5 days exercise. It does not last for a 28-day exercise. Yeah,
you're 100% correct.
Yeah,
and you'll unravel really fast if those trucks don't turn up, if those helicopters don't turn up, and you're forced to stay there longer, you'll unravel. And that's why you've got to be thinking, and it's got to be a combat behaviour, is that, my foot's getting sore today, like that rub point, I might have to do something about that when we get a chance. If you're a commander, why is so-and-so limping like they are?
Yeah.
Well, I noticed a cut on their hand. They haven't tended to that yet. And it's really good that you raise this point, because we have identified that the Deputy Chief of Army, Major General Chris Smith, is big about talking about schoolhouses and the role that they play in setting cultural
norms
and values. And it's interesting that we have dropped off the teaching of free from infection inspections from our promotion courses, our Subject 1 courses for corporal through to warrant officer. And these are things that need to be done every day. It's a command responsibility as well. It's a bit like, the individual might be responsible, but you as the commander are responsible and accountable. And so check stuff gets done, and FFIs are the best way. It's an assurance piece for command to make sure that people don't have anything burbling away that is going to result in requiring medical treatment that requires evacuation, that at the same time is going to drain scarce sustainment resources.
I should have led with this point, but prevention, to link off your prevention, and then before we get into the field, dipping cams and doxycycline, two examples. There's a number of other chemicals or prescriptions that enable you to stop those sorts of things. There's some myths about doxy specifically and dipping.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Okay, so first of all, regarding to dipping, I actively used to dip, and there was a culture of dipping in the 90s of cams. It's something that's faded out. Permethrin that is used is actually our first-line treatment for things like scabies and the like. It's got very good efficacy against parasites. Now, So starting off with a start state of where you're resisting parasites because ticks don't like it, mites don't like it, and the like. I don't know if anyone's ever woken up in the morning and found an infestation of ticks in the side of their head, but like it's not a pleasant feeling, and it's probably even less pleasant for people having to pull them out. So from that regard, that's why we dip. And the other reason why we dip is that little thing called the mosquito that's responsible for dengue fever, malaria, Japanese encephalitis, and a whole host of other diseases. They don't like biting cams. People who are reeking of permethrin who have it in their cams. So permethrin and dipping of cams, should do it.
Yeah. Binary.
And then the next one, doxycycline.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So there's myths. There's all sorts of myths, like having been overseas where doxy was part of the regimen. They're well established. The myths are, and this is one thing we need to talk about. Like there's a good saying in science that one swallow doesn't a summer make. And when we talk about doxycycline, doxycycline, I get doxy dreams. Look, there's a bit of confusion and overlap here between, and we won't get into it now because it's a can of worms, between an anti-malarial drug that was used for certain rotations through East Timor and doxycycline. Doxycycline doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, so it doesn't cause neuropsychological effects. All right, doxycycline, what it can do is that it can cause a bit of an upset tummy, particularly if you take it and then go lie down. So the best thing you do is you take it with food and at the start of the day when you're standing up and going to be standing up for prolonged periods. The other thing it can do is for some individuals, a small cohort, it can cause you to be more susceptible to sunburn. And we need to double back around and talk about sunburn in a second, but doxycycline is amazing for preventing things like scrub typhus. It's the only thing that will prevent and also eradicate scrub typhus. And it also prevents leptospirosis as well, and is also a treatment for leptospirosis as well. And for anyone who's ever had any of those conditions, I've seen quite a number. They usually require very high ceiling of care. So you're talking about burdening the treatment, evacuation, sustainment piece. Now, that's obviously going to have impacts in conflict. More importantly, the impacts that things like this have, unnecessary disease and non-battle injuries in the training environment. The most dangerous thing in the Australian training environment is road movement. So having to go somewhere because people require higher ceiling of care is actually more dangerous than probably the condition to which they're moving to that location for. Maybe not, we'll say, but along the way it induces an unnecessary risk, I guess, which is road movement.
Yeah.
For something that could have been prevented in the first place. And so doxycycline's a safe drug. It's a treatment for pneumonia. It's a treatment for a lot of other things as well. A lot of the intracellular bacteria that you can get, particularly if you're involved in the dressing of animals, like dead animals, slaughterhouses, things like that. There's a whole lot of things like brucellosis and Q fever and things like that. Doxy is a very effective drug for the treatment of those conditions as well.
And I suppose you don't know what tactical tasks you're going to be tasked with. So that talks about the different environments. You don't know where you're going to go. So it's better to prevent it straight away for any sort of threat.
That's why we prescribe it as prophylaxis.
Yeah.
And the other thing we're talking about prophylaxis, like we spoke about it, is sunburn. So back in the old days, before our time, and I guess probably most people who are still in the Army collective time, used to be able to get charged for getting sunburn. And the reason is we spoke about the skin before as being it protects you and all your organ systems inside and the like, is that the skin is, if you get large areas of your skin sunburnt, that ultraviolet radiation results in movement of fluid moving out of your bloodstream into the inflamed area. That ultraviolet radiation has caused the damage. So it dehydrates you very rapidly and can predispose you to heat injury or illness.
So I think that's like how we, what the threats are and why it's so important. You talked about the medical system that underpins when we deploy anywhere, sort of what can support us, prevention being the key thing. We talked about individual skills and how to get after those sort of hygiene practices. And then we talked about command responsibility, talked about inspections and confirming that the things are being done, you know what I mean, that your section or platoon are doing the right thing. Can we come back here at the forefront? So you live and breathe medicine and then subsequently as the senior medical officer at the Directorate of Army Health. Is there any lessons we can take from contemporary conflicts if we change tack to that we can draw back about what we've learned in current conflicts?
Yeah, so we can. So the Ukraine is pretty instructive about what threats we may face to a degree. However, it's important not to confuse that with the operating environment that surrounds Australia, the littoral environment in particular. Again, for those reasons I alluded to earlier about everything from the single strand of RNA through to little parasites and bacteria through to surface and subsurface fauna like sea snakes, box jellyfish, what's on top. Australia's got, and the wider region has a number of extremely venomous animals, and then the heat that's actively trying to kill you. Ukraine doesn't have a lot of those environmental threats. But it's useful to have a look at the Ukraine as a case study anyway, because when we look at what is occupying the most of the hospitals in the Ukraine, infectious disease still is overwhelmingly the largest number. And the problem we have with infectious disease in conflict, and I alluded to it earlier, Todd, is that we've got a lot of things that we didn't have during World War II now, like antibiotics. But what we're finding is the amount of antimicrobial resistance in those people who are infected, who end up in hospital in the Ukraine. They're resistant to a lot of different antibiotics, which makes the treatment that much harder, which means that impacts on your sustainment, which means you've got to be evacuated further to a higher ceiling of care in order to deal with that infection. So I'd say that that's what one thing the Ukraine is teaching us at the moment, for example, and again, the importance of these force protection measures and field hygiene to make sure that we don't unnecessarily strip away combat power.
We normally, we will stow things in bins on vehicles and we'll focus on the deployability of our kit and being able to get capability up forward to fire or affect another capability of the enemy. We wear live plates to protect ourselves, like you mentioned before, in Kevlar helmets. But I think this needs to come to the forefront of stowing stuff into bins. Like we need to get sorted with our sections and platoons and companies and combat teams.
Yeah, no, we do. We need, it's a combat behaviour, just like all those other things. Like cleaning your weapon is also checking yourself over to make sure that you don't have a tick. Because by the time someone, for example, is infected with these things, it's too late. You know, the organisation that they're in probably doesn't have the requisite health support it needs to deal with, if the term we use is sequelae of this infection. So by the time someone starts displaying symptoms of a tick, it's too late. It's systemic. You know, getting that tick out ain't necessarily going to stop what's occurring, the disease process, without probably antibiotics or some form of higher level treatment, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And that recon patrol is down from 6 to 5.
Correct.
4. The sniper pair is not a pair. The artillery M777 is firing with not a full detachment.
You know, half a platoon is not a platoon.
Yeah.
Because people are afflicted with something that was otherwise could have been prevented or managed better earlier. And so it is. You've got to think about, you know, cleaning your weapon, cleaning yourself, looking after my equipment, looking after my feet. Making sure, and we haven't really spoke about this, but the field hygiene article that you're going to dovetail with this as a link in this particular podcast goes into detail about all those things, but also talks about things like sleep and food are also combat enablers as well, or combat multipliers. Now, we know that we have a vote, the enemy has a vote, and that may impact on our ability to eat and sleep, but wherever possible, we should try and aim for the best, aim high, and get as much sleep and food into us when we can, because you never know when your next sleep or food is going to be.
I was going to summarise the episode with a question about top 3 tips. You've just put them all out there. I basically summarised all of the things we need to achieve. Thank you so much for your time today, sir. It's been absolutely awesome.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Todd. Thanks for having me, and I hope I can come back again.
Excellent. No
Thank
worries.
you.
Thanks, sir.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.